Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Rock Solid Apologia podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. We're so glad that you're listening with us today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all the latest news over at RSA. Now, on to today's podcast episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only Apologetics Satire podcast. I'm Will England, Editor-in-Chief of Rock Solid Apologia, and joining me today is Dr. Andy Bannister. Andy Bannister is the Director of the Sola Center for Public Christianity, speaking and teaching regularly throughout the UK, Canada, the USA, and the wider world. Dr. Bannister also holds a PhD in Quranic studies. From the epic sarcasm of Tertullian to the funny retorts of Martin Luther, Satire has been defending truth since the way, the truth, and the life himself became incarnate. We provide rock-solid Christian truth along with rock-solid apologetic satire, all on rocksolidapologia.com. Welcome to the world's one and only Apologetics Satire podcast, Dr. Bannister. It's fantastic to have you.
Will, it's great to be here, and it gets me excited because someone who loves apologetics and loves satire and comedy, I didn't know you existed. So, we need to bring those two things together.
Yes, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Isn't apologetic satire a bit of an oxymoron? I mean, can we as apologists use satire and humor in apologetics, or is that off limits?
Well, yeah. I mean, of course, I always used to assume that oxymoron is a really thick person at Oxford University. But no, I think we can. And I think for a couple of reasons. First thing is, I think humor does some things really well, doesn't it? Humor can build a connection, particularly if you can also be self-deprecating. So don't just poke fun at the other side. If you're willing to have a bit of fun at your own expense, you can break the ice, you can build a rapport. Secondly, I think humor and satire can puncture pomposity. There's a lot of pomposity about in some arguments, particularly the new atheism, which is a sort of waning a bit of late, but there was a lot of pomposity there, if I'm honest. And humor is quite good at coming along and poking and prodding and going, yeah, you really think this is impressive, but actually, what about? And then lastly, Will, I'd say Jesus. We forget, we can read the Bible in such sort of, serious stentorian manner as if the moment anyone raises an eyebrow or smiles, we're somehow being unbiblical. Jesus, man, he knocked it out of the park on so many occasions. I mean, the camel through the eye of a needle. I mean, that's a wonderfully ludicrous image. I mean, forget all that Victorian preaching nonsense about the eye of the needle being a gate in the wall of Jerusalem. No, Jesus meant an eye of a needle. Straightening out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Some of the lines he throws at the Pharisees when he's laying into them. Imagine the crowds just killing themselves laughing. And the Gospels are full of humor. I mean, just one example. One of my favorite bits is the man born blind in John 9 from memory, when Jesus heals him, and then the Pharisees have a go at him for what's happened, and they ask him, about Jesus, and he turns around and goes, "Well, do you want to become his followers too? Is this why you're asking all these questions about him?" And John is quite a satirical gospel. Actually, there's some wonderful humor in there. So humor and satire, thoroughly biblical and really helpful in conversations.
So someone who does humor as well as serious apologetics, where can people find you if people want to find more of this humorous bent on apologetics or more of you? Where can they look to find you?
Yeah, well, just very quickly, one of the reasons I do this, Will, is I'm quite unusual as an evangelist, and I would call myself an evangelist first and an apologist second, that I cut my teeth. I learned my public speaking doing stand-up comedy and magic in my late teens. Those are hobbies I was into. I was pretty terrible, but I learned how to communicate and try and make people laugh along the way. And so that's always been part of my DNA. If people want to find out more about me, there are two ways they can do it. They can go to andybannister.net, which is my personal website, or if they Google me, Andy Bannister, and then put SOLAS, SOLAS, that's the organization I work for. After that, Andy Bannister, SOLAS, you'll find the SOLAS website, and there's loads and loads and loads of content on there, videos and podcasts and articles, and some of it funny, some more serious, some both.
Would you describe most of your books as having a humorous bent, or most of them having a more serious bent, or a good mixture?
Well, yeah, that's a question. My first ever book, which was my PhD thesis when it got published, that struggled to get humor. into it. Doing sort of stylometric computational linguistic analysis of the Quran does not naturally lend itself to a laugh. Although there is one comedy footnote in there. My PhD supervisor, who had a bit of a sort of sense of humor, was like, you've got to get one funny footnote in there. So there is one footnote in there that is just wildly inappropriate and for the context. But then when I wrote, then we come to The Atheist Didn't Exist. And the story behind that book, Will, is that when the new atheism was at its height in sort of 2012, 2013, I noticed there were lots of really wonderful Christian books responding to the new atheism, Alistair McGrath and others. I know Alistair, great books, but they were not really making a huge impact. Christians are reading them, but atheists weren't. And I realized as I leafed through them, it's because, with the very greatest respect to people like Alistair and others, they were a bit dry. They were a bit boring. As evangelical Christians, we can be boring at times. Well, here's an argument. Let me give you 4 propositions and a footnote. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. The reason that the new atheist books are selling by the truckload is they're a great read. Richard Dawkins, Chris Hitchens particularly, they write really well. And okay, as a Christian, how could I write a book that might get read more widely? And then I was wondering how to do that. And I came across a line by C.S. Lewis, where Lewis talked about the fact that often, he said, the front door of people's minds are guarded by watchful dragons. You can't get in the front door. But he said, I began to wonder by using story, whether we might go around the side door. And that was why he wrote the Narnia books. And I remember thinking, well, I can't write fiction, but I can be funny. So maybe we can tickle the dragon under the nose, and while it's rolling on its back, laughing and waving its legs in the air, we can charge through the front door anyway. And that's what that book tried to do. And then I took that, and my 2 kind of later books, the Muslims and Christians one, I should have had the atheist one somewhere, but I don't have any lying around. That one, and then the newest one that comes out next week. They take the same style, not quite as funny, but the thing I really enjoyed doing in The Atheist Didn't Exist is the footnotes. So for listeners who haven't read it, obviously do read it, would make an author very happy, but read the footnotes, because half the fun is in the footnotes. And I did that on the other 2 books. And one of my favorite review I got for this book, somebody said on Twitter, I think it was, only Andy Bannister could get Pride and Prejudice with zombies into a book on Islam and Christianity. And I was like, yes, that's the review I've been waiting for.
I was so surprised because usually footnotes are boring and I skip past them, but I read your footnotes and like, these are hilarious.
Well, the part of the reason is some of the horrific dad jokes and puns. If you put them in the main text, people are going to be weeping. So stick them in the footnotes. But I also learned from 2 of the big influences on me as a writer. This is usually theologians and apologists come out with lofty academic folks, and there's a lot of those. But 2 big influences on me were the comedy science fiction writer Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and the fantasy comedy writer Terry Pratchett. I grew up reading those guys, and they were the master, particularly Pratchett. But Adams could do it too, of the comedy footnote. And I was like, Pete, we need more comedy footnotes.
It's like there's wonderful atheists doing humor, but there aren't Christians doing humor. It's like I did a Why Do Satire at one point, and it was like we've got atheists like Terry Pratchett and Douglas Adams that are beating us Christians in humor. I mean, we have the dry intellectual side covered, but we don't have the humorous side.
Yeah, we're getting there. So, a shout out to a good friend of mine, maybe not so well known on your side of the Atlantic. If people Google Andy Kind, Andy is a Christian comedian over here, and written some brilliant apologetics books, very, very funny. I mean, I look at him in awe because he's, I'm not really fit to untie his sandals because he's just very, very funny. So we have him, but we need more. Yeah. One reason for this, though, Will, I think a couple of reasons. One is that obviously those of us who love apologetics, we can get very obsessed with argument and we forget about the presentation. The reason C.S. Lewis was so influential, he was a brilliant thinker, but he realized you had to capture people's imaginations. And we have sometimes forgotten the importance of doing that. And then secondly, if you go to seminary, Bible college, or wherever and study theology and apologetics, if you go to something like Biola in the States, fantastic institutions, so good, but they don't teach communication. They teach loads of philosophy and theology, and that is really important. But I think more Christian institutions need to teach communication. This is how you connect with people. And if you're not everyone's funny, if you're funny, use humor. But if not, find other ways. But learn to communicate. One thing I often say to students is, go watch TED Talks. Actually, learn a lot from them, because those are often, little 18-minute distilled moments of brilliant communication. Go watch other people who communicate well, and then find your communication style and learn to do that as well as the arguments.
Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, we were talking a little bit about the atheist who didn't exist. Could you give us a little bit of the backstory of that rather epic title?
Well, the title, first of all, is an epic title, isn't it? And I love it. I think it's a brilliant title. And I can say that because I didn't come up with it. It was going to be called Why Sweden Doesn't Exist and Other Curious Problems for Atheism. But my publisher, when I submitted the manuscript, said, Andy, we love the book, but the title is surreal. It's too surreal. People are going to see that on a shelf in a bookstore and go, what is that then? And that was probably the right call. It was a bit too Monty Python. So I'm not very good at titles. So I sort of pinged that back to my editor and went, well, any ideas? And he came up with, he said, what about the atheist didn't exist? I was like, I love it. That is just genius. And the idea behind that, by the way, is it comes right out of one of the chapters in that book, about the third or fourth chapter, which is on science. And the idea of science has buried God. We explore a bit. And one of the things we explore in the book is if you reduce everything to atoms and particles, you explain away everything. You explain away humanity, you explain away mind itself. And actually, you end up explaining yourself out of existence. I've got a great quote from Mary Midgley, who is herself an atheist philosopher, but a nice, friendly atheist, she's dead now, not an angry new atheist. And she says words to the effect of, it's all very well, to explain God away, but explaining humanity away in the process is rather inconvenient. And so you literally become the atheist didn't exist if you go down the new atheist route. You've explained yourself away.
And I feel like it's almost become classic. Atheist says, well, prove to me that God exists, and they're too unreasonable. You say, well, prove to me that you exist. To which I had one professor say, when people ask me to do that, I want to slap them. Which I thought was kind of an amusing response to that.
I would I'd love that. I would actually go, that's brilliant. I would love that you want to slap me. Feel free to do that if it would make you feel better. But that probably suggests to me that you have run out of arguments at that point, because one of the things that the new atheism did, and I want to be very careful here to go, we mustn't assume that all atheists were new atheists. One of the things that actually motivated me to write the book was when I was thinking about writing the book, I was living in Canada at the time, and I mentioned to an atheist friend, I was thinking of I planning to write my first popular book. He said, what do you think of doing it on? I said Dawkins and Hitchens, and he went, oh, for goodness sake. He said, sick of them. He said, they give us atheists a bad name. I was like, we were pleased to know. I'm thinking of having some fun with them. He went, well, you need to. So yeah, there's an awful lot of sound bites going on in the new atheism. And I think sound bites are very easy to poke fun at and deconstruct. And by the way, I want to be very scrupulously fair, Will, and go, Christians are not immune from this. We too, some of our arguments need actually poking. There have been some bad ones over the years. There was a certain, we won't mention who, but you probably know who it is, a certain very famous online apologist did the banana argument, that the argument from the design of the banana. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Yes, go Google banana apologetic. The individual concerned was arguing from design. Again, the banana is so perfectly curved to fit the human hand, and so many other things. And then, of course, it was pointed out that's the result of generations of humans selectively breeding that thing, and he looked rather ridiculous. So that was a good example of a bad Christian argument. It was bananas, in fact.
Well, one of Dawkins' sound bites or sayings is, well, we're all atheists about most gods that humanity has believed in.
Oh, gee.
Some of us just go one god further. And recently, according to the world's one and only Apologetics Satire site, he applied his logic to veganism. So Richard Dawkins, we're all vegetarians about some meats. Some of us just go one cow further. Oxford.
I like that.
In a development no one saw coming, atheist author Richard Dawkins announced on Twitter his intention to become a vegetarian. We're all vegetarians about some meat. Some of us just go one cow further, Richard Dawkins posted in defense of his decision. Besides, I've always wanted to try out a diet of strictly lettuce and tomatoes. When asked if he too would become a vegetarian, Christopher Hitchens replied by saying, I will not become a vegetarian. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Richard Dawkins has given no evidence that it is reasonable to give up all meats just because we've given up some. So why should I give up my juicy steaks? Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens did not reply to our request for comment. So Dr. Bannister, since we don't believe in Zeus, Thor, and Odin, why not reject the Christian God as well?
Great question. And of course, Richard has gone on. And Richard does, I still believe he does, but I believe still eat fish, and is in fact practicing magic tricks with fish, right? Hence his next book, the Cod Illusion. And also, of course, he wrote the book that made him famous was, of course, the shellfish gene. So Richard's got form here. As you pointed out, the vegetarian thing, or the analogy that I and others have used, is going, well, I'm a bachelor with regard to every woman except one. So does that therefore mean I am in fact a bachelor even though I am married? So that it becomes ludicrous. And more seriously, what Richard's argument does is that there's two fallacies in it, and we can have some fun with it, but there's two serious fallacies in it. One is it assumes that all those gods are, in fact, we're talking about the same thing. Whereas if you look at, say, the gods of Greco-Roman mythology, it's pretty clear they're not the grand, the ground of all being. They're not the creator god who brought time and space into existence itself. They're actually creatures within creation. They may be sort of big and very impressive, but they are actually within the created order. We're talking about the one who brought the created order into existence. The first thing is, Richard's not so much comparing apples and oranges as comparing apples and super neighbors. And a little basic sort of theology 101 should have taught him that. But his other problem is he ignores the fact that in much of life, we have a range of options for the answer. And what we have to do by hard work and reasoning it through or thinking through the evidence is work out which of the candidates fits what we're looking for. So to take a very down-to-earth example, crime. Some robbery is committed locally and the police round a load of suspects up and they work through them one by one and they dismiss them all until they get the guy it looks like he did it, and they put him on trial. If he stands before the judge and goes, Your Honor, the police have rejected every other suspect. I encourage you, Your Honor, to go just one suspect further and let me go. Well, presumably the judge is going to go, dude, there is evidence here. And I would be saying to Richard, demonstrably, even without committing yourself to any variety of theism, you would have to recognize that there are different degrees of evidence for some of the different belief systems out there. And by the way, if we push the game slightly further out, rather than talk about religion, what to talk about beliefs? What about going, well, okay, you see, it's very easy as an atheist to go, well, I've got my belief system here and there's all these theists over here. But when you recognize that atheism is itself a belief system, it's a worldview, it's an attempt to answer the big questions of life, the same as Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, or goodness knows what, then actually, if Richard's not careful, he proves too much. Why not just reject every belief system? Why camp on atheism?
So let's go into that a little bit further. Atheists often say that they simply lack a belief. I think in your book you quote Christopher Hitchens as saying, our belief is not a belief.
Not a belief.
Is that true? Is atheism a belief system? And then how does that relate to the case of the Scandinavian skeptic? You can
now you're talking, right. So, well, let's start with our dear old friend, the Scandinavian skeptic, which is where this book began, actually, because I'd written an essay called The Scandinavian Skeptic, and we'll explain who he is in a moment. And then when I was thinking about my first popular book, I had a friend who was an editor at a large UK book company, and we were chatting about book ideas. And I sent him off a collection of essays and went, what about doing a collection of essays? He went, yeah, they don't really sell, really. He said, but one of the essays, which is The Scandinavian Skeptic, he went, we have been laughing out loud in the office all week over that. Could you do a whole book in that style? And I went, yeah, definitely. And and the rest is history. So the Scandinavian skeptic is a classic example, Will, of taking an atheist argument and bringing it into another setting and showing how it doesn't really work. And so our atheist friends, some atheists want to say, that all they do is they lack a belief in God, therefore they haven't got to give evidence for that lack. And so I tell the story, the fictive story, I should stress, in the book, of sitting down in having coffee with a friend who, gaily announces over the Starbucks, over the table coffee, that he doesn't believe in Sweden. And when I have a suitably apoplectic fit, sort of say, what on earth you talking about? That's insane. What's your evidence for that? He's like, oh no, you've made a mistake. You've assumed that my lack of belief in that certain Scandinavian country is in fact a belief. It's not. It's the absence of belief. I just lack a belief in that particular Scandinavian country. I don't need to give evidence for it. Come on. And try as I might, I can't get my friend to consider the possibility that he's wrong. He just keeps coming back to, I just lack an absence of belief in God, all the while he enjoys ABBA music and assembling IKEA furniture. And my point being is that he is in a not dissimilar position to the atheist, as atheism is just a lack of belief. Actually, a lack of belief can be a belief, and we need to give reasons for it. Now, some things we don't. If I say to you, I don't believe there's a hippopotamus in my bathroom right now, probably I'm fairly justified in not giving you a complex range of reasons. Although actually, if you were really insistent, if you were an ardent believer in the presence of hippopotami in bathrooms, I could, take 30 seconds to duck out into my hall and go up the stairs and actually look. So I could actually do the work to show you why my absence of a belief is well grounded. But when it's something bigger, and the thing I think our atheist friends miss is that there is evidence for God. I have respect for an atheist who says, I'm not convinced by the evidence. I have no respect for someone who says there is no evidence. I remember doing a radio debate some years ago with an atheist philosopher called Michael Ruse. Lovely, cuddly atheist. Michael and I got very well. And I was very struck by something he said in our debate. He said, I have no time for fellow atheists who say that Christianity is stupid or ridiculous or any of those things. He says, I believe that Christianity is a very serious answer to a very serious set of questions. He said, I happen to believe it's the wrong answer, but it is nevertheless a very serious answer. And anyone who attempts to explain otherwise is just an idiot. And I wouldn't go be quite as blunt as Michael was, but yeah, that's the point. And then when you begin looking at atheism, well, you discover it has a lot of the attributes of a belief system. So it can be an identity marker. That's a classic sign of beliefs, right? People don't tend to assemble around non-existent things. They tend to assemble around actual things. And so, atheists change their social media profile to little pictures of the flying spaghetti monster and put freethinker in their Twitter profile. They go to atheist conventions. They read atheist books. They self-identify as atheists. That's a very busy non-belief. Furthermore, when you look at more serious work that's been done on belief systems and worldviews, many sort of sociologists and philosophers would say a classic sign of a worldview or a belief is it attempts to answer ultimate questions. Questions like, is there a God? What does it mean to be human? Why are we here? What's the purpose of life? Is there meaning to life? Where are we going? What's gone wrong with the world? The list goes on. Atheism attempts to answer those questions. So it's playing in the worldview space. And lastly, and I've been talking for too long, so I shall pass the baton back to you. There's even worse that some atheists make this assumption, well, we don't believe in God, therefore we can't be a belief system or a religion. I go, hello, there are historically and today religions, belief systems that are atheistic. Shintoism would be a classic example. And then Buddhism, many forms of Buddhism are in fact atheistic. And then that's before we get to contemporary religions like some forms of environmentalism, transgenderism. I don't say that to be rude to those belief systems, but to say they definitely have a religious quality to them, and there's no God at the center of them.
So why do you think it's interesting to me how evangelistic atheists are, which was pointed out in one debate I was listening to. You got to respect atheists who spend their whole life devoted to something that doesn't exist. Like, why do you suppose atheists are so committed to disproving something that in their view doesn't exist? Like, what's the drive to attack Christian belief or like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we again need to be careful because there are a range of answers. So some atheists I have met, I think it's been because they have been badly hurt by the church and by Christians. Not all, but there are some clearly where that's the issue. So there's that real righteous anger. I've come across others who don't have the righteous anger, but have perhaps been raised in a religious setting, walked away from that perhaps in their 20s, and almost felt like cheated. They felt they'd been lied to and deceived. And so there's almost a kind of desire to sort of personally validate their life choices by going, well, I need to, really put the boot into the tradition I came from. Then there are those, and this is interesting because this is where it all began for Dawkins. Dawkins' journey to writing The God Delusion, which has sold like 7 million copies, I believe now. So even though Richard doesn't believe in God, his bank manager gives thanks every day. I think Dawkins he did a documentary in the UK called The Root of All Evil, where he tried to advance this claim that religion is the cause of all evil, war, violence, discrimination, intolerance, bad breath, the list goes on. And I think I partly get that kind of righteous anger. Religion has caused some chaos. I mean, you'd be naive to go, religion has not caused some problems. Where you get a problem, though, and those are the kind of generous options. Then I think, as you say, there are those who just seem to spend their life tilting at windmills. There is no God, so there's, but fine. There's no tooth fairy. There's no whole range of things. Why spend your time, attacking something you don't believe in? But even for those with the more generous answers, the problem you run into, and Dawkins is the classic example of this. If you deploy kind of righteous anger, you run into the moral argument, which you'll be well familiar with as somebody who's passionate about apologetics. You run into the problem of going, well, hang on a minute. If everything is just atoms and particles in motion, what does it matter if the way that one set of atoms and particles behave or think about another set of atoms and particles? It's all just meaningless, which is why you asked me earlier, I think, I can't remember before the show, you asked about favorite atheists. I like some of the French existential guys, Camus and Sartre and those kind of folks who recognize that life is absurd. That was Camus' conclusion. Life is just absurd. It's meaningless. We're in real trouble, right? Because there's atoms and particles in motion, yet we have ideas beyond our station. The other problem you've got if you're a Dawkinsite and an atheist of that ilk, everything is the product of time plus chance plus natural selection. Evolution has produced science. Evolution has produced religion. The same source lies behind everything. And by the way, 98% of humans who've ever lived have been religious. So therefore, we are deeply deluded. And that's the whole human race is deeply deluded. You don't get a get out of jail free card to wave as an atheist. You are part of that great deluded mass of humanity. So, okay, well done. You've escaped the religion delusion, but there'll be lots of other delusions in there because we're a mad, crazy, mixed up mammal. And so that's the problem you run into as an atheist. And therefore, I think it's interesting. If I was an atheist, I think I would be deeply nihilistic, deeply pessimistic, and probably incredibly cynical, because I would think that is the natural outworking of that position. And I struggle slightly with atheists who sort of sit there and go, there is no God, but it's all okay. We can have rainbows and unicorns and kittens and donuts and everything is wonderful.
There's this YouTube atheist that his YouTube name is Cosmic Skeptic.
Oh, yeah, Alex O'Connor, yeah.
I like him, and I mean, I'm sure he'd object to me saying this, but one of the things I really like about him is usually he ends up really messing up the atheist position while responding to the Christians. I mean, I think he did a review of Alistair McGrath's The Dawkins Delusion. It was super funny because essentially what I got from the review was it was Alex O'Connor displaying all the reasons why Alistair McGrath debunked Richard Dawkins wrong.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There have been quite a few atheists actually who have, critiqued the new atheism. I mean, it's interesting. The other one who is probably again more well known on this side of the Atlantic to your side, John Gray, Gray. Got to get the right John Gray. There's the John Gray who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Not that John Gray. There's John Gray, the philosophy prof who was at London School of Economics, has written quite a lot of critiques to the new atheism, and I think one of his more recent books was 7 Types of Atheism, and really interesting. Early on, one of his, I think his first or second type is the new atheism, and he goes for it. I mean, boy, he lays the boot in because he thinks it's meaningless. He thinks it's just so shallowly trite, it's unbelievable. And And yeah, so I find that fascinating that, again, the mistake that we can make as Christians is assuming that atheists are a monolith, and they're not. And many atheists I meet, in my life are not new atheist types. And Alex O'Connor is a lot of fun. He and I never met. He's done a couple of critiques of my early apologetics videos, and that's great. Cool. It helped me sharpen my stuff. I keep saying he and I should do a dialogue sometime. I know I've got friends who know Alex, so he's a nice guy, and I appreciate his willingness to critique his own side. There's a great website called History for Atheists. Tim O'Neill, I think, runs that, and that's a brilliant website, really critiquing, things like the Jesus myth stuff that Tim thinks is just utterly ludicrous. And I came across on Facebook, I don't know if he's got a website, a guy the other day called the Faithiest Atheist. Who's quite fun. And that, again, quite generous atheist, actually, who is quite content to critique his own side. He's quite positive about Christians. And also, I find those atheists who are more interesting and willing to engage fascinating.
Well, some of the new atheists have actually achieved one of their goals, at least according to an apologetic satire site. So after decades of trying, atheists have finally disproved the flying spaghetti monster. So in a decades-long struggle with diehard fans of spaghetti, the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science has finally proved conclusively that the giant spaghetti monster does not, in fact, exist. It turns out it was a figment of Richard Dawkins' imagination, a spokesman for RDFRS told the press. In a statement, atheist Christopher Hitchens added, "We have also been able to disprove the existence of cosmic noodles, quantum super pancakes, and the gravitational pull of the almighty potato." Charles Darwin pushed back against the new atheists, advising them not to come to any hasty conclusions. If we can rule out God, I don't think we can rule out the notion of a quantum super pancake just yet. We need something to create the universe, after all. At publishing time, the RDFRS announced a new initiative to attempt to disprove the existence of God. So I think we've kind of went into it, but is there good evidence for the existence of God versus, say, the flying spaghetti monster or quantum super pancakes or anything like that?
Well, the first thing, of course, we're back to, the one God, many kind of thing of saying the flying spaghetti monster, if that, noodly appendaged creature were to exist, we're talking about a creature. We're talking about something that has a physical existence. It's made of pasta and meatballs and things. And likewise, if you talk about sort of cosmic pancake, again, a pancake is a physical object. When Christians and Jews and to be fair, our Muslim friends would be on the same boat on this one, are talking about God. We're not. We're talking about the ground of all being. We're talking about one who is timeless and immaterial, because we're talking about the one who is the source of time and matter and causality itself. And so one of my critiques to that the flying spaghetti nonsense is going, you're not thinking big enough. It's a very kind of small-minded view of God, and I find it fascinating that that our atheist friends, who can sometimes accuse Christians of being a bit sort of narrow-minded and small and primeval, the best you can come up with is a flying meatball. So that's where I'd begin. Then I'd say, as someone who engages in arguments and stuff as part of my ministry, I mean, I think there's 30 or 40 or more, I think, really good arguments for the existence of God. The first thing I'd say is they often work better together than individually. If you start looking at individual ones, there's always a question mark here, a question mark there. But when you look at the sum total of the evidence, I think it becomes very interesting. But I guess if I was going to pick out two or three, I would say the fact that something exists rather than nothing. I mean, that is the biggest philosophical question of all, right? Science works brilliantly when stuff exists, when we have stuff. Science does not explain how we have stuff in the first place. And that's long been one of the oldest questions. And so that takes you into things like, the cosmological argument and that whole arena. And I think there's a lot to talk about there. And that argument, by the way, I say to atheists, is taken very, very seriously by philosophers, even those who disagree with it. I think of Quentin Smith and others who've argued against the other side. They don't go, it's a crazy argument. They go, it's a damn good argument. And it requires wrestling with. But then onto that, Will, I would also add two other arguments that I, as I get older, I really appreciate. There's the argument from mathematics. See, it's fascinating to explore the question, what is a number? And in a godless universe, what is a number? Well, it's just a mental construct. Numbers are something that Mesopotamian goat herders invented sometime around about the 2nd millennium BC to keep track of their goats. Well, how on earth is it that numbers then plug into physics so well. All the laws that underpin the universe are deeply mathematical structures. So either those goat herders got really, really lucky, or there is something much more complex going on. And if we say, well, hang on, there's a God behind the universe and numbers are an idea in the mind of God, suddenly you get into very interesting territory. And so really, as an atheist, you've only got two choices. You've got God or Platonism, which is fascinating. And then thirdly, I think the argument from mind, I think I found really intriguing. It is really hard to get away from the fact that we have conscious experiences. You know, we're not just having this conversation and going through the motions. You are having an experience of having this conversation. I'm having a subjective experience of having this conversation. And it is very, very odd to begin to even contemplate how, you know, you stick together atoms in such a way that somehow we get consciousness and personality and intentionality emerging. I don't think it can be done. Another favorite atheist writer of mine, a guy called Raymond Tallis, who's an atheist neuroscientist in the UK, wrote a book a few years ago called Aping Mankind, which is a brilliant demolition job on materialism when it comes to mind. So those three together. And lastly, I would add Jesus. One thing I always say to apologists, don't just talk about arguments and disconnect them from Jesus. We're Christian apologists. Therefore, any argument that doesn't either ideally begin or certainly end at Jesus doesn't deserve the title Christian. And of course, as we talk about, you know, a God who is the ground of all being, a God who holds mathematical truths in his mind, a God who created us in his image and mind, we're not talking about any old God. We're talking about the God who stepped into space and time and history in the person of Jesus. And then you've got a whole raft of evidence there in the claims of Jesus, the actions, the deeds, the teachings of Jesus, vindicated by the resurrection. And of course, the historical argument for the resurrection. If I was an atheist, I tell you, the resurrection would keep me awake at night because the evidence is really, really good.
So last question for you, that's a little off script. What's your opinion on the transcendental argument?
Summarize that for me, because I know different versions of it. So which version are you thinking?
I'm going fairly simplistic, the idea that you need God to ground uniformity in nature, the fact that our mind could comprehend the universe, and then you need God to ground the laws of logic.
Yeah, I think I'm relatively persuaded. My only question mark is that sometimes we can come across these wonderful highfalutin arguments that the ordinary person doesn't understand. I mean, I'm conscious with the argument from mathematics and from mind, you're into that territory, which is why when I wrote The Atheist Didn't Exist, I worked so hard to take complex ideas and make them simple. But yes, on the argument from the transcendental argument, anything transcendent actually would fall into that category. Mind, we've talked about to an extent, but I think the fact that we can comprehend the universe with that mind is fascinating because, of course, you know, if evolution is the only game in town, to quote the good Professor Richard Dawkins, really I can see the need for evolution to equip us with the skills to be able to, you know, find food and shelter, you know, keep ourselves alive, so survive with everything that nature throws at us and fight off aggressors, find a mate, reproduce, and then raise our kids the next generation. That's all you need to be able to do. And there are lots of other species on this planet of ours who do it remarkably successfully without getting into philosophy. You know, it's the time of year in the UK when my house is full of spiders. Spiders are remarkably successful. Cockroaches are remarkably successful. You know, insects outnumber humans by billions to one, right? And they haven't had to, you know, develop conscious and abstract reasoning. So the point being, it seems very odd that evolution has come up with us who are as well as able to figure out where the next meal comes from, which is the best cave to shelter in a rainstorm, and which mate looks like her genes are going to be the best for our offspring, is also able to contemplate philosophy and wrestle with the interior geometry of black holes, and on it goes. And I think increasingly I'm struck, Will, that in atheism you have to appeal to luck all over the place. In fact, Dawkins famously talked about Darwinian misfirings. It's one of my most intriguing lines that he uses. I think it's in The God Delusion, where he talks about things like, you know, beauty and meaning and love and art and all those things. He says, oh, they're Darwinian misfirings, blessed mistakes. And it's a lot of his critics picked up on the word blessed is interesting, Richard, because that's a value statement you've brought in there. Mistakes get you. You can go for that on your worldview, but who says they're blessed mistakes? That immediately implies that you see those things as good and valuable and special. So therefore, you've made that moral judgment. And I think our atheist friends are often engaged in what I've elsewhere called value judgment smuggling. They'll smuggle a value judgment into a conversation. And one thing we can do as Christians is gently. We don't want to be smart Alex, or just jerks. We want to go, hang on a minute. That's a value that you've just brought into the conversation. Tell me where that came from. Because to me, it looks suspiciously Christian. But I might be wrong. So tell me where that value came from.
Well, it's been so great to have you on the podcast and discuss atheism and humor, especially with a sort of satirical bent. So I really appreciate you coming on. Anything else you wanna add?
No, I think it's been a fantastic conversation. So I'm glad to see that you are flying the flag for humor and apologetics. Keep going. We definitely need more satire. So I'm always glad to meet a fellow fundamentalist.
Well, that wraps up the latest edition of the world's one and only Apologetics Satire podcast. We want to thank our fellow fundamentalist, Dr. Andy Bannister, for joining us. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast.